49 years ago, in a small, peaceful town in Mississippi, a little girl who had just turned 1 year old vanished without a trace on an ordinary afternoon, leaving her family shattered and desperate. Authorities quickly suspected it was an abduction, launching a widespread investigation, interviewing witnesses, and searching the entire area, but with no physical evidence, very few leads, the case eventually reached a dead end. Yet through all those years, the victim's family never gave up hope, always clinging to the slim possibility that the child was still alive somewhere. Then one day, from what seemed like a very personal and unrelated action, an unexpected detail emerged, a detail that no one in the original investigation had ever considered, powerful enough to completely change the entire case and shock everyone involved. Before we dive deeper into this shocking cold case story, let us know where you're watching from, and if you're interested in cases solved after decades of silence, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next part. In 1959, Mississippi was still a land with a slow pace of life, where small towns existed in a closed-off and familiar way to the point that nothing seemed to need questioning. Greenville, a town along the Mississippi River, lived off factories, farms, and dirt roads connecting low-rise residential areas. People believed in the natural order of life, work during the day, return home in the evening, children playing in the yards, neighbors watching each other out of habit rather than obligation. In that context, the White family was a typical working-class family, not wealthy but stable, living in a small house in a quiet neighborhood, where doors were rarely locked, and young children were watched in a way the whole community considered safe enough. Lisa White, the youngest daughter who had just turned 1, was the center of the family's daily life. At that age, Lisa couldn't yet speak full sentences, was just learning to walk, completely dependent on the adults around her, and spent most of her time in the familiar space of the house and the front yard. The main witness that day was the person directly watching Lisa, a family member so accustomed to the daily routine that leaving Lisa to play within sight for a few minutes was seen as normal, without any sense of danger. That afternoon began like any other, with no clear signs of trouble, no family conflicts, no unusual events noted at first. However, in what seemed like a harmless period of time, a strange element appeared, not clear enough to raise alarm, but also not fully blending into the familiar setting. It could have been the brief presence of someone not from the neighborhood, or an unusual action quickly explained away by subjectivity and the community's inherent trust. The witness noted the anomaly in a fleeting moment, but the initial reaction didn't go beyond vague suspicion, quickly dismissed by the thought that there was no reason to worry on such a quiet afternoon. The time Lisa was out of supervision was very short, just enough to create a gap that no one immediately realized the severity of. When attention returned, Lisa was no longer in her familiar spot. The family's first reaction was to check the usual areas in the house and around the yard, assuming the child might have crawled or toddled to another corner. The initial minutes of searching were spontaneous, unorganized, based on habit rather than fear, because in their minds, a 1-year-old couldn't go far, and certainly couldn't disappear from a neighborhood where everyone knew each other. However, as the search expanded beyond familiar areas with still no sign of Lisa, a sense of unease began to form. The family called neighbors, asked people who had just passed by, trying to piece together what had happened in that brief period. The information received was fragmented. No one was sure they had seen Lisa leave, no one could confirm carrying a child, or seeing a clear action enough to conclude anything. This ambiguity left the family both hopeful and panicked, trapped between thinking Lisa might be very close and fearing something worse had happened. As time passed without results, the family had to face the reality that this disappearance was beyond their ability to resolve alone. The decision to report to the police didn't come immediately, but was the result of a series of futile searches and unanswered questions. By the time the call was made, Lisa White was no longer just a child lost in the neighborhood, but had officially become a missing person case, marking the end of what seemed like an ordinary afternoon, and opening a decades-long void in the history of the White family. The call from the White family was received at the local Greenville Police Department in the context of a 1959 administrative system that still operated under slow and rigid standards, especially for missing persons cases without clear signs of violence. Initial information was recorded based on the relatives' reports, focusing on the victim's age, the last time she was seen, and the family's general circumstances, before being passed through the case classification process. With a 1-year-old child disappearing from her familiar living environment, police had to consider multiple possibilities simultaneously. From wandering off, being taken by mistake, to abduction, though the concept of child abduction at that time was not yet standardized as a priority crime like in later decades. This classification was decisive for the speed and scope of the investigation deployment, because in 1959, not every missing person case was treated as an emergency. However, Lisa's age, and the family's inability to identify any natural destination, prompted authorities to elevate the response level from the start, though still constrained by the era's limitations in manpower and technology. After deciding on direct intervention, police quickly approached the scene, the White family home and surrounding area, trying to determine the last space where Lisa was seen, under conditions where the scene had already been significantly disturbed by prior spontaneous searches. Scene securing was only relative, focused on limiting further disturbance, rather than preserving evidence to modern forensic standards, as the concept of scene protection in child missing cases was not yet deeply trained at that time. During the initial approach, police noted the general living environment, entrances and exits, the front yard, and nearby roads, while trying to reconstruct the timeline based on the memory of family members and those present during the relevant period. Concurrently with the scene approach, the shift commander assigned investigators to the case, usually those experienced in local cases, but not specialized in child-related crimes, reflecting the reality that specialized units did not yet exist at that time. This assignment came with a dual task: collecting initial data in the shortest time possible, while reassuring the family and community, beginning to panic over the news of a missing child. Initial data was collected mainly from statements: who was watching Lisa, who had appeared around the house that afternoon, whether any strange vehicles were seen, and if there were similar precedents in the area. This information was handwritten, without automated cross-referencing systems, and relied almost entirely on the accuracy of human memory under stress. Police also began defining the priority geographic scope, focusing on routes a stranger could quickly take if it was an abduction. While considering the possibility Lisa was still near the scene if the disappearance was just a chain of mistakes. In this early phase, no official conclusions were drawn, but activating the investigation marked the shift from the family's personal efforts to the responsibility of public authorities, where every decision, even small, could directly affect the chances of finding Lisa in the hours and days ahead. The initial data collection, though urgent, was still influenced by the era's limitations, creating a foundation of information that was both necessary and fragile, upon which the entire subsequent investigation process had to rely. After the initial reception and assignment process was completed, the focus of the case quickly shifted to examining the scene where Lisa White was last seen, with the goal of determining whether the disappearance of a 1-year-old child had left any physical signs that could explain what happened. The scene scope was first defined based on family statements and the main witness, including the interior of the house, the front yard, main entrances and exits, and adjacent open areas where a child of that age could normally move. However, from the start, investigators faced an unfavorable reality. The scene was no longer intact. Before police arrived, the family, neighbors and some locals had joined spontaneous searches, moving through various areas to find Lisa as soon as possible, inadvertently blurring the line between potential related traces and ordinary daily activity. Defining the scene scope was thus relative, relying more on reasonable inference than clear evidence, reflecting the investigative methods of an era when preserving the scene in child missing cases was not an absolute priority. During the check of Lisa's living areas, investigators focused on spaces the child frequently occupied, from the bedroom, indoor play area, to the front yard, to determine if there were signs Lisa had moved out of this area on her own. There were no signs of forced entry, no unusual disturbance inside the house, and no evidence of a struggle or violence occurring on site. These observations provided a false sense of reassurance, while raising a more serious question: if there were no signs of force, how had Lisa left this space? In recording related items, police determined that many of Lisa's familiar belongings remained at home, including items a 1-year-old would find hard to leave behind if wandering off for long. This partially ruled out the possibility of Lisa wandering far without adult intervention, while strengthening the hypothesis that her disappearance was not simply a household accident. However, the recorded items showed no clear unusual signs, no stains, drag marks, or any factors that could provide specific clues about direction of movement or exact timing. When assessing the level of scene disturbance, investigators had to admit that most changes in the space resulted from initial search activities rather than criminal traces. Overlapping footprints, moved objects for checking, and constant traffic by multiple people made distinguishing relevant traces from random ones nearly impossible. This posed a serious limitation to the investigation from the early stage, as any subtle signs, if they had existed, were likely covered or destroyed before systematic recording. In that context, the absence of physical evidence became the most prominent feature of the scene. No fingerprints, no strange items left behind, no clear signs of vehicle approach, and no evidence indicating a specific departure direction for Lisa. All police had at this point was a familiar living space, an empty spot where a child had once been, and a series of statements based on unverified memory. The scene examination, instead of providing answers, highlighted the fragility of the investigative foundation, where every hypothesis had to be built on a lack of information, rather than specific physical traces. It was in that absence that the scene of Lisa White's disappearance gradually formed as a space of the undetermined, where each recorded detail mattered not for what it revealed, but for what it could not say about how and why a 1-year-old child vanished without leaving a trace. When the crime scene yielded no clear physical evidence, the focus of the investigation had to shift to the human element, starting with compiling a list of individuals whose presence might have overlapped with the White family's living area during the time Lisa disappeared. People who could have seen something, interacted with someone, or simply been nearby. This list was drawn from multiple sources: family members, neighbors within close proximity, passers-by in the area that afternoon, and individuals indirectly mentioned in others' accounts. Identifying true witnesses was far from straightforward. In a small community, the line between being present and being involved often blurred due to intertwined daily routines and mutual familiarity. Police collected statements in order of priority, beginning with the primary caregiver responsible for watching Lisa, then expanding to other family members, and finally to outsiders. Each statement was recorded manually, focusing on timelines, activities observed, and anything deemed unusual, no matter how minor. In the process, investigators quickly realized that witnesses' memories not only differed in details but contradicted each other fundamentally, especially regarding the sighting of a stranger in the area. Some claimed to have seen an unfamiliar person walking past the house, while others only vaguely recalled a fleeting figure they couldn't describe specifically. When compiled, the descriptions of the stranger failed to form a cohesive picture. Age, gender, clothing, and direction of movement all varied depending on the witness, making it impossible to determine whether these accounts referred to the same individual. This inconsistency did not necessarily stem from any intent to conceal, but reflected the natural limitations of human memory in situations not perceived as significant at the time they occurred. For many witnesses, an unfamiliar person in the neighborhood was not noteworthy enough to commit to detailed memory, especially in a context where the community was considered relatively safe. When revisited in the light of an investigation, these overlooked moments suddenly became central, but by then, memories had been altered by time and post-event conversations. Investigators faced the difficult task of assessing the reliability of each statement, weighing internal consistency, the witness's position at the time of the events, and the potential influence of information from others after news of the disappearance spread. Some statements were deemed more valuable because they were given early, before the community began exchanging and speculating, while later accounts often showed signs of blending personal memory with second-hand information. This evaluation was not intended to dismiss any witness entirely, but to determine the weight each piece of information could contribute to the overall picture. However, even the most reliable statements provided only fragmented pieces, insufficient to establish a clear sequence of events or a specific suspect. The existence of a stranger in the narrative, though mentioned by multiple people, remained vague, unanchored to any identity or specific action. For the investigation, this was a serious obstacle: no description specific enough to pursue, no clear direction of movement to trace, and no independent evidence to confirm or refute the accounts. In this context, the witness file for Lisa White's disappearance gradually took shape as a collection of inconsistent observations, where each account reflected an individual perspective but could not be pieced together into a complete story. The near-total reliance on human testimony, in the absence of supporting physical evidence, made the investigation fragile from this stage onward, raising questions about whether the gathered information could guide the search in the right direction or merely thicken a file full of gaps. Faced with the ambiguity of witness statements and the inability to establish a specific direction of movement from the scene, authorities had to shift focus to a widespread search operation, operating on the assumption that if Lisa White was still in the area, rapidly covering the space offered the most realistic chance of finding her. Mobilization drew on local resources, combining police, available support units, and voluntary community participation, reflecting how missing persons cases were handled in small Mississippi towns at the time. Without scientific search models or probability analysis as seen in later decades, the effort relied primarily on dividing the area into smaller zones and conducting visual checks, based on the belief that a 1-year-old child could not have wandered far without adult intervention. The initial search radius, centered on the residential area where the White family lived, then quickly expanded to dirt roads, open fields, areas along the Mississippi River, and less traveled spaces where a child might have been left or hidden from view. This expansion reflected not only an effort to increase coverage, but also a shift in investigative assumptions, from Lisa possibly wandering off to the possibility that she had been quickly removed from her familiar surroundings. During the search, high-risk areas received more thorough attention, including locations with complex terrain, limited visibility, or difficult access, where a small child could be in danger if abandoned. Teams systematically swept riverbanks, ditches, abandoned structures, and seldom used roads, while maintaining a presence in the residential area in case Lisa was returned or appeared unexpectedly. However, all efforts took place under conditions of limited equipment and methods: no search dogs, no modern detection tools, and no detailed maps for systematic spatial analysis. Community involvement, though driven by goodwill and a desire to help, had a double-edged nature. The large number of searchers meant the expanded scene continued to be disturbed, reducing the chances of detecting subtle signs if they existed. Over time, the search had to extend not only spatially but temporally, lasting hours and then days, while the likelihood of finding Lisa safe diminished with each passing interval. Each area checked without results narrowed viable hypotheses, but also heightened the sense of impasse among the search teams. The failure to uncover any direct trace of Lisa, from clothing or belongings to signs of movement, gradually shifted the operation from urgent to sustained, where efforts continued but without clear expectations. For the investigation, the lack of results from the widespread search was as significant as any discovery would have been, reinforcing the view that if Lisa had left the area, it happened quickly and organized, beyond the local community's immediate response capacity. As the search radius continued to expand without new findings, the operation approached practical limits of manpower, time, and sustained community attention, especially without fresh information to guide it. The silence of the scoured spaces, from familiar areas to the most remote within range, painted a troubling picture. Lisa White had left no trace clear enough to be detected by direct search methods. Though yielding no answers, this outcome served as a turning point in the investigators' understanding, forcing them to acknowledge that the widespread search, under the conditions and limitations of 1959, could not further narrow the possibilities. The operation, initially expected to be the primary means of bringing Lisa back in the early days, gradually wound down with the only conclusion possible at the time. No evidence suggested Lisa White was still in the controlled area, and the absence of any physical traces pushed the case into a more indeterminate state, where each subsequent investigative step would rely on inference rather than direct discovery. The complete lack of results from the widespread search forced the case's approach to shift focus from space to people, based on the assumption that Lisa White's disappearance could not be explained by random factors or ordinary accidents. With no physical traces to follow, investigators began circling potential suspects, using the scattered information gathered from witness statements and existing knowledge of the local community. The list of possible suspects emerged from various groups: strangers seen in the area that afternoon, non-residents with reason to pass through, and individuals previously noted by police for unusual behavior. This circling was not based on behavioral analysis models or systematic criminal profiling, but largely reflected traditional investigative methods of the era, where investigators' personal experience and gut feelings about something off played a larger role than objective data. Individuals under suspicion were successively brought in for questioning and verification, aiming to establish their whereabouts during the time Lisa disappeared, their means of transportation, and any connection to the White family's living area. Questioning occurred under limited tools, no audio or video recording, making assessments of statement consistency entirely dependent on investigators' memory and handwritten notes. Some were quickly cleared due to statements corroborated by independent sources, while others lingered because they could not clearly prove their location at the critical time. Alongside questioning, police checked criminal records and personal files of potential suspects, looking for links to prior offenses, especially those involving violence or child harm. However, record-keeping in 1959 was fragmented and localized, so these checks only captured part of each person's history, insufficient for a comprehensive risk profile. Results showed most circled individuals either had no significant prior record or no direct link to Lisa's disappearance, causing the suspect list to shrink without substantial progress. Some remained under watch, not due to specific evidence, but because there was no basis to fully exclude them, creating a suspended investigative state, where suspicion coexisted with inability to prove it. It was at this stage that the investigation began showing signs of veering off course, as pressure for answers led some hypotheses to be pursued too long, without new supporting data. Time and resources were expended verifying individuals who left no clear trace, while other possibilities could not be tested due to lack of information. The insufficiency of evidence to charge any suspect not only highlighted legal limitations, but exposed the fragility of the entire investigative foundation, where each step relied more on supposition than proof. Each cleared suspect made the gap in understanding Lisa's disappearance more apparent, as no alternative hypothesis was strong enough to replace it. The wrong directions in this phase did not stem from lack of effort, but from operating in an environment lacking tools, data, and influenced heavily by rudimentary investigative standards. Circling suspects, questioning, verification, and record checks, conducted as rigorously as possible at the time, ultimately produced no breakthrough, leaving the case file thicker but empty of evidence. This state forced investigators to confront the reality that the suspect's specific approach had reached its limit, while the central question, who took Lisa White and how, remained without any reliable explanation to grasp. The status of the investigation at this point was shaped by a comprehensive review of everything that had been gathered since the day Lisa White disappeared, with the goal of determining whether any unexploited data or overlooked connection might open up a new direction. The investigators went back through every part of the file, from the initial statements of family members and witnesses, crime scene notes, and wide-area search results to the list of verified suspects, cross-referencing them to identify overlaps or contradictions that could hold investigative significance. However, this review process quickly revealed an unavoidable reality. All the data had already been utilized to the maximum extent possible under the conditions and knowledge of the era, and no new elements emerged to alter the overall picture of the case. The old statements, when re-examined, retained their original vague and inconsistent nature, providing no additional information that could lead to a specific individual or location. The crime scene records, which had lacked physical evidence from the start, offered no added value upon reanalysis, as there were no samples, traces, or objective data that could be retested using alternative methods. In that context, the absence of new leads was not the result of a lack of effort, but a direct consequence of an information base that was already exhausted. Every hypothesis that had been proposed had been pursued to its limit, and continuing to repeat old verification steps only consumed additional resources without increasing the chances of finding answers. This impasse became even clearer when compared to the technological limitations of the era, where criminal investigations relied almost entirely on human testimony and direct observation. There were no DNA analysis tools, no federal database for missing children, no rapid information sharing system between jurisdictions, and no ability to trace behavior through digital footprints, simply because they did not yet exist. All efforts were constrained within a narrow geographic scope and short time frame, making any actions that occurred outside those boundaries virtually disappear from the investigation's reach. The investigators were well aware that if Lisa's disappearance involved an individual not from the local community, or if she had been taken out of the area in a very short time, the available tools were insufficient to follow that trail. The lack of capacity for long-term data storage and analysis also meant that the case file could not be effectively reactivated without entirely new information emerging. During the re-evaluation process, the investigating commanders were forced to weigh the option of maintaining an active investigation with limited resources against the responsibility to allocate personnel to other cases in the area, especially when there were no indications that continuing to pursue the case in the current manner would yield different results. The decision to prepare to halt the active investigation was not made abruptly, but was the outcome of multiple internal discussions, where each investigative step already taken was reviewed and compared against the potential for further action in the near future. This did not mean the case was forgotten or fully closed, but reflected an acknowledgement that under the current conditions, every feasible approach had been tried without producing answers. For the case file, this status was recorded as a significant turning point, where active pursuit gave way to storage and preservation of information, in the hope that one day, these seemingly useless data points could be viewed from a different angle or with tools that did not exist at the time. For the White family, the investigation reaching its limits brought neither comfort nor closure, but only marked the end of a phase where they could still expect concrete progress from the authorities. From an investigative perspective, this deadlock exposed the clear boundary between effort and capability, between the desire to uncover the truth and the reality that not every case could be resolved with the methods available in that era. Preparing to halt the active investigation thus became a technical but heavy step, as the entire file was organized, archived, and marked in a way that allowed it to remain in the system, awaiting a different condition, different information, or a different time that could completely change how Lisa White's disappearance was understood and handled. The investigation no longer being maintained in an active state led to a procedural decision with long-term consequences for the entire case, changing the status of Lisa White's file from an ongoing investigation to a long-term unsolved case, or what was internally classified by law enforcement at the time as a cold case. This decision was made after the command levels reviewed the entire investigative process that had been conducted, compared available resources with the likelihood of generating new information in the near future, and concluded that there was no practical basis for continuing to maintain high priority for the case without additional leads. The new status of the file did not mean the case was administratively closed, but reflected a shift in handling, from active searching and verification to preserving what had been gathered for potential re-examination in a different context. All investigative data, including interview transcripts, crime scene diagrams, search notes, witness and suspect lists, was reorganized according to the standard archival structure of the era, primarily as paper files that were categorized and stored in the local police department's storage facility. This storage was static, with no automatic update mechanism or periodic reminder system, meaning the file would only be accessed again upon specific request or when new information, if it emerged, was strong enough to trigger attention from the authorities. During the status transition process, the investigators formally noted that Lisa White was classified as a long-term missing person, a categorization with legal and statistical implications, confirming that her absence was no longer viewed as a temporary situation that could be resolved through routine search measures. This classification directly affected how the case was handled within the system, as it was removed from the high-priority list and no longer assigned dedicated personnel for ongoing monitoring. From an investigative standpoint, classifying it as a long-term missing person reflected an acknowledgement that time had passed the threshold where traditional methods could be effective, especially in a context with no indications that the victim was still in the area or capable of returning on her own. For the White family, this change brought a reality harder to accept than any official conclusion, as it marked the point when they no longer received regular updates from the authorities about the case's progress. The communications, which had already become infrequent, now nearly ceased, not because the case was forgotten, but because there was no new information to share, and no specific investigative activities underway. The family was informed of the file's new status in an administrative manner, with explanations about resource limitations and the ability to continue the investigation under current conditions, but this did not lessen the feeling that the case had slipped out of both their control and that of the legal system. The transition to cold case also meant that any new information, if it arose, would not automatically trigger an immediate response, but would have to undergo re-evaluation to determine whether it was valuable enough to reopen the file. In practice, this created a significant psychological and procedural barrier for anyone wishing to provide information in the future, as there was no longer an active investigative team waiting and monitoring. At the system level, Lisa White's file became part of the collection of unsolved cases, existing alongside many others with similar characteristics, each one a stack of papers recording the efforts expended and the limitations encountered. Storing data under the conditions of that era also carried the risk of degradation over time, as documents could be damaged, lost, or lose their original context if not accessed regularly. Although the investigators were aware of the importance of preserving the file, the ability to maintain data integrity over decades was a challenge that had not yet been tested at that time. The cold case status was thus not merely an administrative classification, but a freezing of the investigative process under the specific conditions of the era, where time began to become the greatest adverse factor. For the local community, the prolonged silence from the authorities gradually caused the case to fade from daily life, shifting from a shared concern to an uncomfortable but increasingly distant memory. For the White family, the lack of information brought no sense of closure, but only prolonged an indefinite state of waiting, where hope and despair coexisted without clear boundaries. From an investigative perspective, transitioning the case to cold case marked the end of a phase of active effort, while opening an indefinite period where the file's fate depended entirely on the emergence of factors beyond the prediction and control of those who had participated in the initial investigation. While Lisa White's case file was archived and gradually sank into a state of inactivity within the investigative system, the life of that child did not stop with the stack of papers placed in storage, but continued to take shape in a completely different space, detached from Greenville and bearing no identifying signs of the past. In Louisiana, not too far geographically from Mississippi, but different enough to become a separate world, a little girl grew up in a different family, under a different name, with an origin story accepted as the only truth she had ever known. Life there did not resemble a tragedy or obvious concealment, but unfolded in the ordinary rhythm of a child in a working-class family, where days passed filled with school, the neighborhood, familiar relationships, and milestones of growing up just like anyone else. The identity she carried from her early years was built on a set of legal documents, according to the standards of the era, sufficient to allow her to attend school, access health care, and exist within the administrative system without significant obstacles. However, that set of identity documents itself lacked the historical depth of typical records, as it was not tied to infant memories, not accompanied by family stories passed down through generations, and not reinforced by clear timelines from the moment of birth. For the little girl when she was young, this absence did not create a specific problem, as children accept reality through what is present around them, rather than through what is missing. She grew up calling those who cared for her by familiar terms, accepting family relationships as a given, and integrating into the Louisiana environment, without reason to suspect that her life had begun elsewhere. Her personal records were gradually formed over time, with each year adding a new layer of data, from school records to basic administrative documents, creating a continuous chain of information from the point she was first recorded in the system. This chain of information, though technically seamless, lacked the opening portion that most people never notice, as it is usually taken for granted. The years that passed in that outward stability carried no memories of Greenville, Mississippi, nor contained any elements that directly evoked the disappearance that had occurred, as no one in her current environment mentioned or knew about that story. The substitute identity she used was not a temporary shell, but became the foundation for her entire process of personal formation, from how she viewed herself to how society viewed her. In daily interactions, she existed as an independent individual, not tied to an unsolved case, not bearing the label of victim or missing person, and showing no signs that her life had once been the subject of an investigation. This separation created a quiet paradox. While the legal system recorded Lisa White as a long-term missing person, the person carrying Lisa's DNA lived a life completely unaware of that file's existence. Her personal records in Louisiana continued to develop according to ordinary milestones, with each new document further reinforcing the legitimacy of her current identity, while inadvertently covering the gap in her biological origins. Any questions about her background, if they ever arose, were not specific enough to lead to action, as in the social context of that era, questioning documents or family stories was not common, especially when there were no clear contradictions. Everyday life, with its immediate priorities like education, work and social relationships, continued to occupy full attention, making the gaps in her personal records fade into minor details, rather than issues needing resolution. From an external viewpoint, no event was unusual enough to attract the attention of authorities or the community, and from her own perspective, the current identity was the only reality that had ever existed. It was this prolonged normality that made Lisa White's story, in this phase, not take the form of an ongoing case or tragedy, but resemble a completely different life, built on an administrative and social foundation solid enough to avoid suspicion. The formation and reinforcement of her personal records over time created an invisible layer of protection, where every new piece of information built on previously accepted old data, making the ability to trace back to the starting point increasingly difficult. While the cold case file in Mississippi lay dormant in storage, neither updated nor cross-referenced with any new data, the personal records in Louisiana continued to evolve, growing along with the person carrying them, creating two parallel streams of existence that did not intersect. The first was the recorded absence in the investigative system, and the second was full presence in everyday life, bearing no signs of a rupture. It was this parallelism that laid the foundation for a unique reality of the case. The victim of a disappearance did not vanish from the world, but only vanished from the awareness of those searching, while she herself continued to exist as a complete individual in a different context, with a different name, and a history built from the moment she was first recorded in the system of another state. The outward normality of life in Louisiana was maintained by a paperwork system sufficient for an individual to exist legally, but within that system there existed gaps that over time began to reveal their abnormality, though not always immediately recognized. Her birth certificate, the foundational document for her entire legal identity, existed as a technical starting point rather than a comprehensive record of origins, with limited information and lacking the details typically found in records established right from the moment of birth in a hospital. There was no accompanying chain of documents confirming the birthing process, no clear administrative traces linking to a specific medical facility, and no supplementary records typically generated in a child's early years. This deficiency did not create immediate obstacles in daily life, as the administrative system of that era allowed documents to be accepted based on formal validity rather than historical completeness. However, when viewed as a whole, that birth certificate resembled a piece fitted into a picture where the background behind it had been left blank. Additionally, her childhood records did not form a continuous chain as commonly seen, with early life milestones such as routine health checkups, vaccinations, or early school enrollments either completely absent or appearing sporadically, insufficient to reconstruct a coherent timeline from infancy. These gaps were not filled by clear family memories or stories retold over time, as information about the early period was either presented simply or not mentioned as an important part of personal history. The lack of childhood records did not create immediate issues in a social context where data storage was not yet standardized, and many families had incomplete paperwork histories, especially in working-class areas. The relative commonality of deficient records reduced the likelihood of recognizing that this case was different in nature, not just missing a few documents but lacking an entire phase of identity formation. When considering the ability to verify origins, these limitations became clearer, as there was no administrative path leading back to a definitive starting point. There were no biological records for cross-referencing, no recorded names of biological relatives, and no traces indicating the existence of a legal or illegal transfer process documented in the system. Any efforts to trace origins, if ever considered, stopped at the existing data, which was only sufficient to confirm that she legally existed from a certain point onward, without answering how she had arrived there. The personal data accumulated over time was thus fragmented, with each piece of information existing independently, without being linked by a continuous historical axis, creating a record that appeared functionally complete, but lacked depth in origins. Subsequent administrative documents, from educational records to employment papers and other civil records, all built upon the initial birth certificate foundation, inadvertently reinforcing an identity that no one verified from the root. The system operated on the principle of data inheritance, where new information was accepted based on old, causing initial gaps not only to remain, but to be overlaid by additional layers of data. In that process, no automatic warning signals were triggered, as there were no federal cross-checking mechanisms or interstate verification requirements for accepted personal records. From an administrative perspective, This identity was valid and sufficient for all practical needs, from education to employment, and from a social viewpoint, it carried no elements abnormal enough to raise questions. However, when examining each component of the record separately, the fragmentation became evident. Like a book starting from the middle chapter, missing the cover and introduction, yet continuing to have new chapters added without anyone pausing to ask about the lost pages. This identity gap was not a random deficiency, but the result of a person entering the system at a point not corresponding to a natural birth, and then being accepted by the system as if everything had always been that way. In that context, the inability to verify origins did not create direct conflict, but existed as a background condition, quietly shaping how this identity was constructed and maintained. For the person bearing that identity, these gaps were not always perceived as a problem, as daily life was guided by what was present and verifiable, rather than by what was absent. Only when viewing the entire record from a holistic perspective, where each piece of data is examined not for its current function, but for its place in a complete historical chain, did the absence emerge as a central feature. The identity gap, therefore, was not a readily noticeable flaw in everyday life, but a structure lacking foundation, existing alongside a seemingly complete life, waiting until an external factor strong enough forced it to be recognized as an issue requiring explanation. The gaps in the identity record did not prevent life from moving forward, and over time, the bearer of that identity entered adulthood with all the milestones society considers normal and valid. Life in Louisiana offered familiar choices: leaving school, joining the workforce, building lasting social relationships, and eventually forming a family of one's own. Marriage did not occur in any unusual context, but followed the trajectory of an individual fully integrated into the surrounding community, where the current identity was accepted without needing explanation or additional verification. The new family was formed based on relationships built in everyday life, not tied to stories of origins or distant past, as nothing in the present required reverting to those questions. Along with family stability, her civil records continued to be strengthened through routine administrative procedures, from residency registration, employment records, to documents related to marriage and children. Each completed procedure built on the existing data foundation, inadvertently further solidifying the legality of the current identity and making it increasingly difficult to question. The administrative system operated on inheritance logic, where a valid document from a prior stage became the basis for subsequent ones, causing initial deficiencies not only to persist, but to be covered by an increasingly dense network of data. In that context, an identity without a clear past did not create direct conflict, as society primarily judged individuals based on current behavior and adherence to common norms, rather than tracing neonatal history. Newly formed family relationships also did not focus on origin stories, as trust was built on shared experiences and current responsibilities, not on administrative data from decades earlier. Adult life thus unfolded in a state of relative stability, where social roles were fully assumed, from worker, spouse, to parent, depending on specific circumstances. Throughout this process, there was no connection between the ongoing life and the missing person case once recorded in Mississippi, as these two existences did not intersect in information systems or in the awareness of those involved. The cold case file remained dormant in storage, not cross-referenced with any developing civil data in Louisiana, and the current identity continued to function as if it had always existed from the beginning. This lack of connection was not the result of intentional concealment in the adult phase, but a natural consequence of no mechanism linking disparate data across states and different eras. Life was built on what was visible and verifiable in the present, while what was missing from the past was not seen as an issue needing resolution if it caused no specific obstacles. Over time, the responsibilities of adult life consumed full attention, from caring for one's own family to maintaining economic stability, making vague questions about origins, if they ever arose, insufficient to become a motive for seeking answers. The current identity, despite lacking clear historical foundation, was still solid enough to support the entire life structure built around it. In that context, not linking to the old case was not denial or avoidance, but simply reflected the reality that for the person living this life, that incident had never existed within personal awareness or experience. The two timelines, one recording a disappearance and one recording full presence, continued to flow parallel without intersection, creating a deceptive stability where everything seemed to have found its place. This very stability, reinforced over years of adulthood, made the past gap harder to recognize than ever, as when a life has been built with full relationships, responsibilities, and legal records, questioning its starting point was no longer obvious or urgent in the eyes of those living within it. The stability of adult life did not completely erase the long-existing gaps in the personal record, but over time, those gaps began to be viewed as unanswered questions, especially when the role of parenthood, or responsibility toward the next generation, made the need to understand one's own origins clearer. Initial curiosities did not arise as specific suspicions, but as a sense of missing information when comparing personal history to what is typically considered complete in other families, where stories of background, ancestry and blood ties are passed down naturally. The need to trace origins thus did not stem from a single event, but gradually formed from realizing that the current identity, though legally valid, still lacked a foundational layer of information that could not be supplemented by memories or ordinary administrative papers. In the context of genetic testing services becoming widespread and accessible as a personal tool rather than a criminal investigation method, the decision to take a DNA test emerged as a reasonable choice to seek answers, not to solve a case or challenge an identity, but to fill the information gap about biological origins. This decision was personal and voluntary, carried out outside any legal framework or intervention by authorities, reflecting how genetic technology had moved out of laboratories and into everyday life. Access to genealogy services occurred through platforms allowing users to submit biological samples and compare data with increasingly expansive genetic databases, where millions of profiles were stored for the purpose of connecting individuals with blood relations. In this process, DNA was treated as an objective information code, detached from personal stories, yet capable of linking historical lines that traditional administrative systems could not. Submitting the test sample carried no specific expectations about results, as there were no clear assumptions about what might be discovered, only a desire to access a data source different from the fragmented papers that had existed before. The waiting period for results became a pause, where no other actions were taken beyond continuing daily life, but it also opened the possibility that long-standing questions could be answered in an entirely new way. During that time, there was no change in the legal or social status of the current identity, and no indication that this personal test could extend beyond privacy to touch forgotten records in the investigation system. However, the simple act of entering one's genetic information into an open database created a potential intersection between two parallel existences, one of the ongoing personal life and one of unresolved historical records. Even without specific results, the decision to take a DNA test marked the first time the current identity was placed in direct relation to objective biological data, rather than relying solely on administrative papers and previously accepted stories. The first thread of truth thus lay not in the test results, but in the very opening of the possibility that biological origins could be traced using tools previous generations never had, creating conditions for a comparison that transcended geographic, temporal, and other boundaries that had once left the case in stasis. In this moment, nothing was yet confirmed or denied, but the existence of a new information channel was enough to shake the assumption that the gaps in identity would forever remain unfilled, laying the groundwork for the possibility that genetic data, once compared in the right context, could lead to connections no traditional investigation method had ever achieved. The waiting period for the DNA test results ended with a dataset that did not resemble a simple answer but instead opened up a chain of issues far more complex than the initial expectation of confirming biological origins. The first result revealed that the genetic data did not match the family that had raised and bonded with the individual for decades, a finding that was objective but sufficient to reset all prior assumptions about blood relations that had been accepted up to that point. This mismatch did not exist as a vague contradiction, but was clearly expressed through genetic markers showing no direct biological connection to those considered blood family in the current personal records. This discovery did not mean that legal identity was denied, but it created a clear gap between biological reality and the constructed origin story, forcing the DNA data to be treated as an independent source of information that could not be altered by memories or administrative documents. Along with that conclusion, the genealogy analysis system continued processing the data and provided potential blood connections to other individuals in the database, expanding the genetic picture beyond the scope of the current family. It was during this process that the results began pointing to unexpected connections concentrated in Mississippi, a location that had never appeared in any personal stories or administrative records before. These connections were not isolated random coincidences, but a collection of genetic relationships close enough to suggest that the biological origin was directly tied to a specific geographic area. The expanded kinship data revealed the existence of multiple individuals sharing identical DNA segments, sufficient to establish relatives at various levels, from distant to relatively close, forming a network centered outside Louisiana. The emergence of Mississippi as a convergence point for the genetic results raised a fundamental question about personal history, as it completely contradicted the life story built in both perception and paperwork. The genealogy system provided not only a list of potential connections, but also probability indicators, allowing estimates of the degree of biological closeness among individuals in this network. These figures were not absolute affirmations, but strong enough to rule out random coincidence, especially when multiple links pointed to the same geographic area and a specific lineage. Analysis of biological relationship probabilities showed a much higher likelihood of a direct connection to a family in Mississippi than any other hypothesis, clarifying that the DNA data was telling a different story from the one accepted for years. The abnormality of the results lay not in finding distant relatives, but in the fact that the entire kinship structure suggested a completely different origin, with no intersection to the current identity, except for the person carrying the DNA itself. This forced the data to be viewed not as a reference tool, but as significant biological evidence, raising the possibility that some past event had separated legal identity from biological origin in a way not recorded in the system. Each new identified link further reinforced the internal consistency of the genetic picture, as the relationships among individuals in the Mississippi network did not contradict each other, but formed a logical structure based on verified genetic laws. Meanwhile, the complete absence of biological links to the raising family made it clear that the current identity was not the result of a minor record error, but a complete break at the biological level. The results did not carry an explanation of how that break occurred, but they confirmed that biological origin could not be found by re-examining existing documents, but had to be traced through the genetic data itself and the connections it revealed. The appearance of Mississippi as a focal point did not automatically tie to any specific historical case in personal awareness, but it created a clear direction for questioning the past, as this was the first time a specific location had been identified by scientific method rather than speculation or memory. The expanded kinship data, with overlapping connections and increasingly clear biological relationship probabilities, turned the possibility of a biological family in Mississippi from a vague hypothesis into a statistically grounded conclusion. In that context, the DNA results were not merely a personal discovery, but a breaking point in the identity structure maintained for decades, forcing biological reality to be weighed against all prior stories, documents and assumptions. It was this systematic abnormality that made the DNA data impossible to ignore or explain simply, as it did not just deny one relationship but opened the possibility that a life had been built on a foundation that did not accurately reflect true origins, requiring a re-examination of the entire context of identity formation from a more scientific and objective perspective. The consistency and scientific weight of the DNA results meant that this data could no longer be viewed as purely a personal discovery, but began raising questions about the potential link to an unsolved case within the criminal investigation system. Moving the DNA data beyond the scope of personal genealogy services occurred as a cautious step, with the results compiled, standardized, and presented in a way that could be understood and evaluated by authorities, rather than existing only in a commercial platform's user interface. The data was selectively presented to clearly highlight key blood connections, the identified geographic area, and biological relationship probability indicators, providing an objective basis for considering whether this was valuable enough information to trigger a formal investigation process. Notification to authorities was not done randomly, but directed to units with jurisdiction over long-term missing persons cases, where pending files are stored, and sometimes re-reviewed when breakthrough new information emerges. In that context, the DNA data was received not as an accusation or immediate demand for resolution, but as information needing independent evaluation, separate from the personal story of the provider. When the information was submitted, the initial response from authorities was cautious, as the investigative system had received many leads claimed to be important, but ultimately unverified. However, what set this case apart was that the genetic data provided a rare form of objective evidence capable of directly connecting a living individual to an unresolved missing persons file, rather than just testimony or speculation. The cold case unit, responsible for handling dormant cases, was assigned to receive and assess the information, as this department has access to old files and experience in cross-referencing modern data with historical records. Acceptance did not mean the case was immediately reopened, but marked the start of a screening process to determine if the DNA data had sufficient reliability and relevance to pass the initial review threshold. During that process, Cold Case Unit investigators cross-checked the geographic information indicated in the DNA results against lists of unsolved child missing persons cases in Mississippi, looking for matches in timing, age, and circumstances. Verification began concurrently on multiple levels, from checking the integrity of the genetic data and confirming the testing method used, to reviewing archived files to see if any case fit the presented biological profile. This was a process requiring high caution, as any error at this stage could lead to pursuing an inaccurate investigative direction, especially since cold case files often contain incomplete information affected by time. The DNA data was examined not as conclusive evidence, but as a potential key, needing to be tested against various locks in the file system to find where it might fit. Investigators paid particular attention to child disappearances from the late 1950s, when data storage and sharing capabilities were limited, and many cases had stalled due to lack of leads. In the initial verification, the focus was not on pursuing perpetrators or reconstructing criminal acts, but on the more fundamental question whether this genetic data could link a specific individual to a recorded missing persons case. This required coordination among various information sources, from old administrative records and family data of missing victims, to civil records confirming the continuous existence of the DNA provider. The initiation of verification was thus more technical and analytical than field investigation, reflecting a fundamental shift in how cold cases can be approached in the era of genetic data. In that context, the cold case unit served as a bridge between past and present, where dusty paper files were placed alongside modern DNA analysis tables, and each potential match was examined with high caution. Receiving and processing the DNA data did not produce immediate conclusions, but it broke the prolonged stasis of the files, turning a once frozen case into one re-examined with tools the original investigators never had. This change marked an important shift in the case's progress as personal biological information was introduced into the criminal investigation system, not as a supplementary factor, but as a foundation capable of reshaping the entire understanding and handling of a decades-long missing persons case. The DNA data, passing the initial screening stage, enabled the 1959 missing persons file to be returned to active status, beginning with the recovery of the original records that had lain dormant in storage for decades. The paper files were retrieved from physical archives, including initial intake reports, witness statements, scene diagrams, search reports, suspect lists, and internal notes reflecting how the investigation unfolded in the specific historical context of that era. The recovery process was not simply reassembling documents, but also assessing their condition, identifying what remained intact, what was missing or lacking context due to time, and what needed reinterpretation to align with modern understanding. Once the original file was restored to the maximum extent possible, focus shifted to reconstructing the investigation timeline, a necessary step to understand the sequence of actions taken, decisions made, and points where the original investigation reached its limits. This timeline was built not only from recorded dates, but also by cross-referencing documents to verify consistency and identify gaps that investigators of that era could not fill. Reconstructing the timeline allowed the cold case unit to view the entire case as a continuous process rather than disconnected actions, clarifying how the case shifted from urgent to stalled and eventually to cold status. In the next step, old data was placed alongside new data, creating a systematic comparison between what was known in 1959 and what modern technology was now providing. Information such as location, victim age, disappearance circumstances, and vague descriptions of strangers was cross-checked against genetic markers, blood connections, and the geographic area identified from DNA results. This comparison did not aim to completely replace old data, but to test whether previously posed hypotheses could be re-evaluated in light of biological information. During this process, some details once deemed unimportant or unverifiable at the time began taking on new meaning when placed in the context of an objective and independent data source. Identifying points of overlap became the focus of this phase, as the cold case unit searched for specific intersections between the missing persons file and the DNA data, such as matches in age, timing, and geographic location indicated by blood connections. Each overlap point was examined carefully, not just statistically, but for reasonableness in the social and administrative context of the era. This required combining modern data analysis with historical knowledge to avoid imposing today's standards on decisions made in a different time. During file reopening, investigators also had to confront irremediable limitations, such as the absence of biological samples from the scene or victim's family at the time, complicating direct comparisons. However, the current DNA data served as a bridge, allowing these gaps to be overcome by using the expanded kinship network to infer biological relationships. As overlap points began forming consistently, the 1959 file was no longer seen as an isolated case, but as part of a longer story, where the disappearance was placed alongside the continuous existence of an individual bearing a different identity. Comparing old and new data also clarified the limitations of the original investigation, not as failure, but as a consequence of that era's technology and methods. What was once unverifiable due to lack of tools now became accessible through genetic analysis methods and federal data connectivity. The reopening process thus aimed not only to seek answers for a specific case, but to re-evaluate the entire investigative progression from a different perspective, with biological data at the center. As overlap points were identified with increasing reliability, the case file began shifting from hypothetical to verifiable status, though additional verification and cross-checking steps were still needed before any official conclusions could be drawn. At this point, what mattered was not whether the case was solved, but that it had been returned to the flow of investigative activity, with a stronger data foundation and an approach vastly different from decades earlier. Reopening the 1959 file thus marked an important transitional phase, where the past was no longer frozen in old files but placed into a new analytical process, allowing each detail to be re-examined with connection and verification possibilities the original investigators could never have imagined. The matches established during the 1959 case file reconstruction and the comparison of old and new data created a new investigative state where hypotheses no longer existed independently but began to converge around a central conclusion that needed to be verified at the highest level, confirming the biological identity of the missing victim. From this point, DNA data no longer served as a guiding tool but became the core foundation of the entire subsequent process, requiring authorities to implement the confirmation procedure with absolute precision and caution. The DNA matching with the White family was conducted through multiple independent steps to eliminate systematic errors, starting with identifying surviving close blood relatives who had a sufficiently close kinship relationship to provide statistically valuable comparison samples. The collection of biological samples was carried out according to current forensic standards, with sealing, coating, and storage measures to ensure the integrity of the samples and traceability of their origin in case cross-verification was needed. The DNA samples were analyzed at independent laboratories, using multiple different genetic markers, rather than relying on a single gene segment, to confirm the blood relationship on the basis of statistical probability far exceeding the threshold of random coincidence. The analysis results showed a degree of genetic similarity consistent with a direct blood relationship between the individual being verified and the White family, not just in a single marker, but consistently repeated across the entire genome analyzed, thereby ruling out the possibility of confusion with distant relatives or rare population coincidences. However, in the context of a case spanning decades, no matter how strong the biological conclusion, it was not considered sufficient if not correlated with other existing data in the file. Therefore, parallel to the DNA matching, additional forensic checks were implemented to confirm that the biological conclusion did not contradict any recorded historical, anthropological, or administrative factors. Investigators reviewed traceable personal characteristics from the White family's medical records and rare genetic traits previously noted to remaining anthropometric details in the old file, comparing them with current data to seek consistency. Although most physical evidence from 1959 no longer existed, the alignment between the DNA results and these indirect data points formed a chain of cross-verification, significantly reducing the likelihood of error or hasty conclusions. When the additional checks all yielded consistent results, the confirmation process moved to a different, more complex but equally important level: legal identity confirmation. This was the step that transformed the scientific conclusion into a reality recognized within the administrative and legal system, and also the step requiring the most careful consideration, as it directly involved an identity that had legally existed for decades. Authorities had to clearly determine that confirming Lisa White's biological identity did not mean denying or erasing the legal identity that the individual had carried throughout their adult life, nor did it invalidate established civil rights and obligations. Instead, the goal of this process was to record the biological truth in the system, adding it to existing records in a way that created no legal gaps or administrative conflicts. Interagency discussions were conducted to assess the impact of updating the identity on related areas such as civil registration, civil records, family relations, and federal data, ensuring that all changes were made on the principle of supplementing information rather than reversing existing legal history. When these conditions were met, Lisa White's identity was officially confirmed not only as an investigative conclusion, but as a legally recognized entity, linking the original biological identity with the person existing in the present. The updating of official records was implemented synchronously across multiple systems, from the missing persons file in Mississippi, where Lisa White had been classified as a long-term missing person, to relevant federal databases on identification and personal status. Each update was accompanied by detailed notes on the data sources, verification methods, and scope of the conclusion, to ensure transparency and future auditability. This process did not occur as a single action but as a controlled series of adjustments, reflecting the change in the case's status from undetermined to identity confirmed, while preserving the entire prior administrative and investigative history. In this context, identity confirmation was not merely technical, but represented the merging of two historical timelines that had existed parallel for decades, one recording the disappearance of a child, and the other recording the continuous presence of an individual under a different identity. This merging could not erase the interrupted years, but it brought biological, legal, and historical truth to a single point of convergence, where the case was no longer divided between missing and existing. The updated file reflected a reality far more complex than what had been envisioned in the early investigative phase, when all hypotheses revolved around the possibility that the victim was no longer alive. Now the same file recorded that the victim had lived a full life while her case remained frozen, and that her biological identity had been restored with the highest degree of certainty that modern science and law could provide. However, this confirmation process also highlighted insurmountable limits, as science could answer the question of identity but could not fully explain on its own the social, personal, and circumstantial mechanisms that led to the initial rupture. Nevertheless, within the framework of the investigative process, identity confirmation marked a decisive milestone where decades-long ambiguity was replaced by a clear, proven, and officially recorded conclusion. The case file, from this point, no longer existed as a document of absence, but became a record of confirmation, reflecting the capability of modern investigation to resolve questions that time had seemingly made unanswerable. The official confirmation of Lisa White's biological and legal identity created a decisive transitional moment for the entire case, when the conclusion was no longer confined to the internal investigative team, but became information that needed to be communicated according to established administrative and legal procedures. The verification results were compiled into official reports, clearly presenting the confirmation methods, DNA data sources, additional forensic verification steps, and legal basis for recognizing the identity, to ensure that all receiving parties had a unified framework of understanding. Notification was carried out in order of priority, starting with the missing persons archives in Mississippi, then relevant federal units, and finally parties that had participated in or been directly affected by the case in the past. Each notification was accompanied by specific guidance on how to update records and how to use the new information to prevent misinterpretation or use of data outside permitted scope. When the verification results were widely received in the system, the case status was officially adjusted, reflecting a fundamental change in the nature of the file. Lisa White was no longer classified as long-term missing, but recorded as identity confirmed and alive, a seemingly simple terminological change, but one with profound meaning for the entire investigative process. This status change ended the decades-long phase of searching for the victim, while clearly marking the end of one type of question and the opening of another. The case file, after updating, no longer focused on locating whereabouts but shifted emphasis to understanding the circumstances and mechanisms that led to the initial disappearance. Along with the status change, the investigative direction was also adjusted to fit the new reality, as the hypotheses that had dominated the investigation for years were no longer applicable once the victim was determined to be alive. The investigation shifted from searching for scenes, new witnesses or physical traces, to reanalyzing old data in light of the new conclusion to determine the nature of the 1959 event within the limits allowed by evidence. The focus was no longer where is the victim, but how did the victim leave the original context and exist under a different identity for such a long time. This redirection required investigators to reassess the value of each statement, each note, and each assumption made in the past, determining which factors previously overlooked or unexplained could now be reinterpreted differently. However, the investigative redirection also imposed clear limits, as most data needed to reconstruct event details no longer existed, and many key witnesses were no longer capable of providing information. In this context, authorities had to balance the need to clarify historical truth with the responsibility not to create expectations beyond the system's capabilities. Parallel to adjusting direction, preparation for the next step was implemented cautiously, not to accelerate the process, but to ensure that all subsequent actions were based on a solid legal and ethical foundation. Investigators, along with legal advisors, evaluated possible and impossible actions, from continuing to review remaining hypotheses to determining the final boundary for pursuing criminal responsibility. This preparation also included considering how to manage information in the future, ensuring that data related to the victim's identity and current life were properly protected, while still allowing the case file to fully reflect achieved conclusions. In the process, authorities also had to consider the impact of identity confirmation on involved parties, especially the biological family that had lived in prolonged waiting, as well as the individual who had existed under a different identity for decades. The victim being located, in terms of the file, was not just an investigative outcome, but an event capable of creating complex psychological, social, and legal consequences, requiring a cautious and responsible approach. Therefore, this phase was seen as a necessary buffer between identity confirmation and any subsequent actions, allowing the investigative system to shift from verification to evaluation and preparation. The case file, at this point, reflected a new reality, where the central question had been answered, but the full meaning of that answer was still being processed. Notifying verification results, changing case status, adjusting investigative direction, and preparing the next step did not occur as isolated actions, but as a tightly linked series of decisions, each building on the previous, and aimed at bringing the case to a more stable legal and investigative state. In this context, the victim being located was not viewed as an immediate endpoint, but as an important transitional milestone, where the case moved from prolonged uncertainty to a new phase, where the truth had been confirmed, but how to handle that truth still required careful consideration. This transitional phase laid the foundation for the system's subsequent steps, while shaping how the case would be recorded and understood in investigative history, not only as a case of finding a victim after decades, but as an example of how modern investigation can alter the fate of files seemingly frozen by time. The victim being determined alive, and having existed under a different identity for decades, forced the investigation to reverse back to the starting point of 1959, with an entirely new core question, no longer focused on locating whereabouts, but on the nature of the initial disappearance. In this state, all old statements were systematically reviewed, not to seek new information, but to reassess the value of what had been recorded in light of the current conclusion. Investigators sequentially reread statements from the family, primary witnesses, neighbors, and individuals who had appeared in the search area, paying special attention to details previously considered vague, inconsistent, or insufficiently substantiated to pursue at the time. Descriptions of strangers appearing near the activity area, short interruptions in child supervision, and initial hesitant adult reactions were now placed in the context of intentional conduct rather than a random chain of events. This review was not aimed at assigning responsibility to individuals who participated in the search or investigation, but to determine whether a behavioral pattern existed that aligned with abduction scenarios documented in later criminological studies. From the old data, the investigative team reconstructed plausible abduction scenarios based on what was known about the social circumstances of 1959, when registration, monitoring, and child protection systems had many gaps, especially in small communities where mutual trust was the norm. One scenario considered was the possibility that the victim was taken by an individual not from the local community, exploiting superficial familiarity or momentary negligence to approach and separate the child from the family without immediate attention. Another scenario raised the possibility that the act lacked violent motive, but was a form of appropriative nurturing, where the child was placed in a different environment and quickly integrated under a new identity, exploiting administrative gaps of that era to avoid detection. These scenarios were analyzed based on factors such as the speed of disappearance, the absence of physical traces, and the ability to maintain an alternate identity long-term, all consistent with the reality that the victim lived a full life without detection for decades. However, scenario analysis did not equate to identifying a specific perpetrator, as each scenario existed only at the hypothetical level, unsupported by remaining direct evidence. When shifting to evaluating prosecution feasibility, investigators faced clearer legal and practical limits than ever. Most individuals potentially directly or indirectly involved in the initial event had passed away or were no longer capable of providing reliable statements, making reconstruction of criminal conduct based on witnesses impossible. Remaining statements, though historically valuable, did not meet the proof standards required for a criminal case, especially in a context where human memory had faded over time and could not be cross-verified. Additionally, the statute of limitations for pursuing criminal responsibility for potential acts, if classified as crimes under current law, had become an insurmountable barrier in many scenarios, even if a hypothetical suspect's identity could be proposed. The lack of physical evidence further clarified the limits of prosecution feasibility, as no biological samples, physical items, or recorded documents existed to directly link a specific individual to the abduction. The administrative gaps that once allowed the child to be recorded under a different identity simultaneously erased traces needed to prove criminal conduct, creating a paradox where the success of concealment became the factor preventing later accountability. In the evaluation process, investigators had to clearly distinguish between historical truth that could be reasonably inferred and legal truth that could be proven in court, recognizing that the two concepts do not always align. The inability to prosecute was not viewed as a failure of the current investigative process, but as an inevitable consequence of elapsed time, initial technological limitations, and the strict proof standards required by the legal system. This recognition led to a candid assessment that the reverse investigation of the abduction could illuminate the context and mechanism of the disappearance, but could not produce a binding criminal conclusion. Hypotheses recorded in the file were not intended to identify perpetrators, but to define the most reasonable scope of understanding what occurred, while clarifying the final boundary of what the system could achieve. In this state, the reverse investigation was no longer an effort to pursue a specific individual, but a cognitive closure process, where questions were posed and answered within the limits permitted by evidence and law. The absence of direct evidence did not diminish the value of the review and analysis, as it provided a clearer picture of how the incident likely unfolded and why it remained beyond the system's reach for decades. The file, after incorporating these analyses, reflected a complex truth, where an act may have occurred but could not be pursued under modern standards, and where criminal justice had to stop at the boundary of evidence. In this context, The reverse investigation of the abduction did not yield a traditional resolution, but it completed a necessary circle, moving the case from prolonged ambiguity to a state clearly understood in nature, even if not fully resolvable through legal tools. When the reverse investigation into the kidnapping reached the point where every hypothesis had been analyzed within the limits allowed by evidence and law, the case progressed to a different phase, where the focus was no longer on pursuing criminal responsibility, but shifted to addressing the direct consequences of confirming the victim's identity. In that context, organizing the reunion between Lisa White and her biological family was regarded as a necessary step, not only from a humanitarian perspective, but also administratively and legally, to complete the file's status after the identity had been officially confirmed. From the outset, the authorities determined that this meeting could not take place spontaneously or purely on an emotional basis, as it was tied to a decades-long investigation file and could potentially create legal consequences if not managed properly. Therefore, selecting a neutral location was prioritized as a mandatory condition to separate the reunion from spaces associated with the painful memories of the case or the private lives of the parties involved. The chosen location had to meet multiple criteria simultaneously, including safety, controllability, and suitability for official documentation and recording, reflecting the true nature of the event as a step in the file processing procedure rather than a symbolic activity. The choice of a neutral space also aimed to minimize unnecessary psychological pressure and avoid creating expectations or interpretations beyond what the legal system could fulfill. Alongside determining the location, the presence of authorities was considered an indispensable element in organizing the reunion, not to monitor emotions or control individual behavior, but to ensure that the entire proceedings of the meeting were accurately recorded and consistent with prior conclusions. Authorized representatives participated in roles of verification and witnessing, ensuring that the individual whose identity was confirmed was indeed Lisa White according to the agreed biological and legal criteria, while protecting the file's integrity in case any disputes or misunderstandings arose later. The presence of authorities also helped clearly delineate the boundary between the personal and legal aspects of the reunion, emphasizing that this was not a hearing or a trial procedure, but a practical confirmation step in the case processing process. Throughout this process, completing the identity confirmation was carried out as a final procedure to transfer the scientific and legal conclusions from paperwork to real-world context, where the directly involved parties were present together. Identification details were cross-checked again, minutes were drawn up and signed for confirmation, recording that Lisa White's identity had been confirmed not only on the basis of data, but also in social reality. This held special significance for the case file, as it marked the first time since 1959 that the victim's biological identity had been fully restored and recorded in a controlled space, witnessed by the legal system. However, the reunion organization process did not stop at identity confirmation, but also included clearly recording potential legal consequences arising from the event, to avoid misunderstandings about the rights and obligations of the parties after the meeting. The authorities proactively clarified that confirming biological identity and organizing the reunion did not automatically alter Lisa White's current legal status, nor did it create new legal obligations for the biological family or the family that had raised her for decades. The legal identity that had existed throughout her adult life continued to be fully recognized, while the biological identity was added as a historical and personal element, forming two parallel layers of information that the legal system had to acknowledge and manage. This recording of legal consequences was clearly reflected in official documents, including reunion minutes, file updates, and related notes, to ensure no future confusion between identity confirmation and changes to legal rights. Issues such as inheritance, family relations, civil obligations, or other rights were determined not to automatically arise from the reunion unless separate legal procedures were initiated under current regulations. This clarity played a key role in maintaining stability in her current life and preventing disputes that could arise from misinterpreting the legal meaning of the meeting. Throughout the entire reunion organization process, the authorities maintained a coordinating and recording role, without imposing interaction methods on individuals, but also without withdrawing from the responsibility to ensure the legality and order of the process. Every step was designed to balance the humanitarian aspect of reconnecting a disrupted relationship with the legal requirements of a decades-long investigation file. It was this balance that highlighted the unique nature of this phase, where the case was no longer viewed purely as an investigative question, but as a living reality with long-term consequences for the person at its center. When the reunion was completed and necessary minutes were drawn up, the case file reflected a new status, where the victim had been found, the identity confirmed, and the legal consequences fully recorded. However, like previous phases, this completion did not signify absolute closure, but served as a transitional milestone, moving the case from the verification phase to the consequence handling and final evaluation phase. Organizing the reunion, therefore, was not merely a symbolic event, but a structural step in the case process, where the legal and investigative system had clarified what could be clarified, established boundaries for what could not be resolved, and brought the file to a more stable state, legally and administratively. The fact that the reunion was organized and officially recorded did not immediately close the case process, but opened a prolonged post-processing phase, where the legal and administrative system had to adjust to reflect a newly confirmed reality. The first step in this phase was adjusting related civil records, a task requiring high accuracy and a cautious approach to avoid unintended legal consequences. Lisa White's missing person record in Mississippi was updated to note that the victim had been found and identity confirmed, ending the long-term missing status that had existed for decades. However, this update did not mean erasing or replacing the civil records formed during her adult life in another state, as those records reflected a long-established and stably operating legal reality. Instead, the system chose the approach of supplementing and linking, recording the biological identity as a restored foundational layer of information, existing parallel to the current legal identity. The authorities coordinated to ensure these adjustments were made synchronously, avoiding conflicts between databases and preserving the continuity of established civil rights and obligations. In this process, each update was accompanied by detailed notes on the scope and limits of the adjustment, to ensure no future confusion between confirming biological identity and changing current legal status. As the civil record adjustments were completed, a complex reality gradually emerged: the parallel existence of two families in the life of one individual, each representing a different historical line that could not deny the other. The White family, tied to memories of the disappearance and years of silent waiting, existed as the restored past, carrying deep biological and historical meaning. Meanwhile, the family that had raised and accompanied Lisa White through most of her life represented the present and the experiences that shaped her, from emotional relationships to social and civil responsibilities. The legal system did not attempt to merge these two families into a single entity, nor did it establish hierarchy or priority, but acknowledged the parallel nature of the two relational lines as an unavoidable consequence of the prolonged identity disruption. This parallel existence was not resolved through rigid regulations, but recorded as a reality to be managed with legal clarity and personal respect. In that context, expectations of fully restoring the past were gradually replaced by the realization that some things could not be reversed, even though biological identity had been confirmed and the biological family connection re-established. The lost years, non-existent childhood memories, and relationships not formed during critical life stages were beyond any system's intervention. Identity confirmation brought clarity in terms of truth, but could not recreate experiences that never occurred or compensate for the passage of time. This drew a clear boundary between what law and science could resolve and what forever belonged to the realm of personal experience and human emotion. In the post-reunion phase, the authorities focused on ensuring the case file fully and accurately reflected the entire process, from identity confirmation to recorded legal consequences, to bring the matter to an administratively stable state. The file was finally reviewed to ensure all key conclusions were clearly noted, hypotheses fully evaluated, and investigative limits transparently stated. This was not intended to close discussion of the case in public opinion or the personal lives of those involved, but to confirm that, from the legal system's perspective, feasible investigative objectives had been achieved. The case in this state was closed on paper as one resolved in terms of identity, though without a final criminal conclusion regarding the initial act leading to the disappearance. This closure did not deny remaining questions, but acknowledged that the system had reached the limits of what could be achieved with current tools. Closing the file was done with clear notes on the scope of resolution, emphasizing that the victim had been found and confirmed, while other aspects could not be further addressed due to lack of direct evidence and insurmountable barriers of time. The post-reunion state, therefore, was not a complete emotional ending, but a new balanced state, where truth had been confirmed to the highest possible degree, and remaining gaps honestly recorded. The two families continued to exist parallel in one individual's life, each carrying its own way of facing the new reality, while the legal system withdrew from its central role, retaining the file as an official record of what had occurred. The case viewed from this angle was no longer an indefinitely open question, but a case that had reached a reasonable stopping point, where further pursuit no longer yielded investigative value commensurate with legal and social costs. Closing on paper did not erase the long-term impact of the matter, but it allowed the system to continue operating and allocate resources to other files still awaiting resolution. In that context, the post-reunion became the phase most clearly reflecting the limits of justice and human capacity to confront the past, where confirmed truth was not to reverse time but to provide a foundation for the present and future. Closing the case file after the post-reunion phase did not mean the question of the perpetrator and criminal responsibility disappeared. On the contrary, it forced the investigative system to confront directly the ultimate limits of justice in a case spanning decades. At this stage, all hypotheses formed throughout the investigation, from the early days of 1959 to when the file was reopened with DNA data, were synthesized in a final evaluation to determine what could be reasonably understood and what could not be proven to legal standards. The central hypotheses revolved around the possibility that Lisa White had been taken by an adult individual, not related to the biological family, exploiting a brief lapse in supervision and the prevalent trust in the social context of that era. Some hypotheses emphasized kidnapping in the sense of usurping custody, where the child was not directly harmed, but placed in a different living environment and integrated under a new identity, while others raised the possibility of involvement by a known individual or someone with access to the family, without immediately raising alarm. Despite differing details, these hypotheses shared confirmed common points: the rapid disappearance, lack of physical traces, and ability to maintain an alternate identity for a long time without detection. However, under the legal lens, all these hypotheses faced the same fundamental barrier: the absence of elements necessary to shift from reasonable inference to prosecutable evidence. One of the greatest obstacles was the fact that most key witnesses were no longer alive or capable of providing reliable testimony. Those present at the time of the incident, who saw unusual details or participated in the initial search, had passed away over time, taking memories that could not be verified or cross-checked with modern methods. Stored statements in the file, though historically valuable, did not meet the standard for direct courtroom testimony, especially without cross-examination or clarification of initial inconsistencies. The absence of living witnesses made efforts to identify a specific individual responsible for the initial act fragile, as no one could directly confirm witnessing the abduction or child transfer. Alongside the witness issue, the statute of limitations for criminal prosecution played a decisive role in assessing prosecutability. For many potential acts related to unlawful taking or child removal under the laws of that era, the statute had long expired, creating an insurmountable legal barrier, even with additional indirect information. Even assuming a suspect could theoretically be identified, the legal system would not allow the case to go to trial without meeting statute and evidence conditions. The lack of direct evidence further highlighted this limit, as no physical evidence, administrative documents, or biological data existed to link a specific individual to the abduction in a way meeting criminal proof standards. The administrative loopholes that once allowed Lisa White to be recorded under a different identity simultaneously erased traces needed to prove the crime, creating a paradox where the past success of concealment prevented present accountability. In that context, investigators had to sharply distinguish between historically inferable truth and legally provable truth, acknowledging that the two concepts do not always align. Inability to prosecute was not seen as a failure of the modern investigation, but an inevitable consequence of prolonged time, initial technological and methodological limits, and legal standards designed to protect individuals from unfounded convictions. In the final evaluation, hypotheses were recorded in the file not to name a specific perpetrator, but to clarify the most reasonable scope of understanding what likely occurred, while clearly defining justice's boundaries in this case. Criminal justice was acknowledged as unattainable, not due to lack of effort or indifference, but because essential elements for a verdict had been lost to time. This acknowledgement was honest and necessary, as it prevented pursuing infeasible investigative paths and creating false expectations about the system's capabilities. Instead, the case file recorded that criminal responsibility could not be established, while the core truth about the victim's fate had been clarified to the highest possible degree. Accepting justice's limits did not mean denying the case's importance. On the contrary, it placed the case in its proper historical and legal context, as an example of what the system can achieve and what lies beyond its reach. In this state, the perpetrator question was no longer posed as an open investigative goal, but as part of the overall picture, where answers might exist at the inference level, but could not be transformed into legal action. The file, completed with these conclusions, reflected a complex truth that some cases cannot complete the circle of criminal justice, but that does not diminish the value of seeking truth, confirming identity, and restoring historical place to the victim. It was in the tension between what can be known and what cannot be proven that justice's limits were most clearly revealed, not as failure, but as an unavoidable reality, in cases spanning generations. Acknowledging that criminal responsibility could not be established marked the practical end of the investigative process, opening a comprehensive evaluation phase of the entire matter from Lisa White's disappearance to her identity confirmation after nearly half a century. Looking back at the entire process, the case clearly reflected the evolution of investigative work across eras, from initial reactive efforts in the limited context of 1959, to prolonged stalemate when the file became a cold case, and finally reactivation thanks to tools the original investigators could not have imagined. The first steps, though carried out seriously with considerable resource mobilization within the era's capabilities, soon hit limits of technology, methods, and data, causing the case to gradually fall into inaction, not from lack of concern, but from no viable path forward. The file's cold status for decades reflected a common reality for thousands of other missing persons cases, where the question was not where the victim went, but whether the system still had tools to find the answer. In that context, DNA genealogy emerged as the key factor changing the case's entire trajectory, not by adding a small clue but by creating a structural breakthrough. Instead of searching within eroded geographic or witness networks, Genetic data allowed investigation to transcend space and time boundaries, connecting an existing individual to a file frozen for decades. DNA genealogy did not function as a traditional investigative tool, but as an objective matching system, where biological relationships were established by statistical probability rather than testimony or guesswork. In this case, the tool not only confirmed the victim's identity, but also provided the basis to reopen the file, reevaluate old data, and repose questions seemingly meaningless. However, evaluating DNA genealogy's role also required balanced recognition of its limits, as while powerful enough to answer identity questions, it could not alone fully reconstruct the crime or replace lost physical evidence. The Lisa White case was thus recorded as partially solved, with the core question of the victim's fate clearly answered and scientifically confirmed, while questions about perpetrator and motive could not be resolved within current legal frameworks. Designating it partially solved was not evasive or diminishing of the investigative process, but an honest reflection of the completeness the system could achieve against insurmountable limits of time, evidence, and law. When the file was closed, final notes were added to clarify the scope of resolution, emphasizing that the victim had been found and identity confirmed, while noting that criminal responsibility could not be established due to lack of direct evidence and legal barriers. Closing the file was not ending concern, but a necessary management decision confirming all feasible investigative paths had been pursued, and no reasonable basis remained for further expansion. In a broader sense, the Lisa White case provided an important lesson for the cold case field, showing that seemingly hopeless files could still be illuminated in unexpected ways if approached with appropriate tools and flexible thinking. At the same time, it reminded that not every case can reach a complete criminal resolution, and that the value of reopening files lies not only in prosecution potential, but also in restoring truth, identity, and history to those erased from public awareness by time. For the investigative system, this case became evidence of the need to preserve files, standardize data, and be ready to re-examine old assumptions when new technology emerges. For other cold cases, it set an important precedent. Closing a file does not mean permanently ending resolution potential, but only reflects the state of knowledge and tools at a given time. When the Lisa White file was returned to storage with updated status, it was no longer a symbol of hopeless disappearance, but a complex record of family persistence, investigative evolution, and science's ability to reconnect what was once broken. Closing the file, in this instance, did not signify forgetting but the necessary completion of an investigative cycle, where the most important questions had been answered to the highest possible degree, and where the system transparently acknowledged both its successes and its limits. The story of Lisa White reveals a very American reality today. The system can be stronger, but risks come from the very complacency of everyday life. In 1959 in Greenville, Mississippi, the White family lived in a everyone knows everyone community, doors rarely locked, young children watched by habit. That very sense of safety, combined with a moment of hesitation over an unusual detail, created a supervision gap of a few minutes, and for a 1-year-old, a few minutes was enough for everything to change. The first lesson is in modern America, whether you live in a quiet suburb or a city, treat child safety as a process, not a feeling. If there are strange signs around the house, yard, or school, the note it and move on reaction is a weakness. Establish clear family rules: who is responsible for watching, for how long, where the safety boundaries are, and what to do if a stranger approaches a child. The second lesson comes from the investigation. The scene was disturbed by spontaneous searching, leaving police without physical evidence. Today, if an emergency occurs, searching must still be fast, but also preserve clean zones, entrances, potentially related objects, cameras, neighbors with Ring doorbell, and record times, directions of movement, license plates, things that did not exist in 1959. The third lesson is the power of technology. DNA genealogy reconnected two parallel lives after decades. That reminds us to use technology proactively, keep medical records, update photos, use appropriate tracking devices, and if a family has identity gaps or origin questions, know that genetic data can be the key, but also consider privacy, share information selectively, and work with authorities when needed. If the story of Lisa White makes you think about those seemingly ordinary moments that can change an entire life, please subscribe to the channel to continue following in-depth analyses of more cold cases. Thank you for watching to the end, and see you in the next video, where we continue seeking the truth for stories once buried by time.